Well, I want to welcome to the show Matt Fradd. I'm so grateful for Matt giving time today to help us explore some crucial, just excruciating, but fundamentally important topics today, all centered around this evil that has emerged in our time, pornography. Matt, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Matt, so having had a chance to read your book, Restored, it is such a striking, heart-wrenching book full of testimonies of women, wives, and one daughter who talk about the impact of pornography on their marriages. What is it that brought you into the writing of that book, the telling of those stories, along with your wife, Cameron? What is it that drew you into this entire area of ministry?
Yeah, so several years ago, I experienced a good degree of freedom in my own life from pornography. And it was at that point that I decided I'd like to begin talking about it a little more, because at the time there weren't a great deal of people speaking about it. So that was about maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And so I've been speaking and writing on it gradually from that point. About 2 years ago, we released a book for men and women who struggle with what they might call pornography addiction. And so that was called Delivered, True Stories of Men and Women Who Turn from Porn to Purity. And that book was received really well. So what we wanted to do is create a book for the spouses of the ones who are addicted to pornography or sex. Because it seems to me that this is the overlooked group. If you think of the carnage that porn has wreaked upon our society, it's great that there are a lot of men addressing other men about how to begin to be free of this. We even see a lot of women, thank God, speaking to other women about battling their own pornography or masturbation use. But there's not a great deal of people addressing wives. And so that's why we put together this book. So if often a wife will say to me, my husband looks at porn, what do I do about him? How can I help him? And these are good questions, but there's a prior question that I think ought to be asked, and that's, how can I help me? Because the wife who has discovered that her husband has been looking at pornography or having an affair or what have you, has usually suffered some degree of trauma which needs to be addressed, and hence the book.
Matt, your wife Cameron writes in the introduction to the book about the degree of this trauma, that statistically it's 70% of women whose husbands are addicted to porn display the symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And she goes on to identify in really stunning insight the difference between a wife whose husband is addicted to porn and the way that PTSD shows up in her life as compared to, say, for instance, the wife of someone in the military, because of the hidden nature of pornography. Would you talk to that?
Yeah, so she's referencing a small study that was done. I believe it was around 200 wives, going off memory, and they found, as you say, about 70% of these wives exhibited the signs that one would expect from someone suffering PTSD. And so there's beginning to be a lot of people who are addressing this issue. Bloomforwomen.com is a fantastic new website out there that's dealing specifically with this betrayal trauma that a wife can experience when her husband discloses or she discovers that he's been looking at pornography or doing something else unfaithful sexually. But as you say, you don't get time off work for this. You can't go to your boss and say, this has been happening, I need to get time off. One, you probably wouldn't want to because you might think it a shameful thing. But two, it's often not regarded as that serious. The wife is often told either explicitly or it's hinted at that, she should just grow up and stop being such a prude and just sort of, be okay with this. And that's not okay. It's not cool.
Well, and Matt, I think about the way that the way that Cameron described wives who are like, I want to hide this from my kids. I want to hide this from my friends, from my neighbors, from people at church. So it's as if they have nowhere to go. There's nowhere to. They have to act normally. They can't disturb the peace in the home, and yet they have this inner trauma that they've experienced, where there's a number of questions that emerge. Not only the rage that is part of why have you betrayed me? But other things like, is it that I'm not good looking? Am I not sexually desirable? And a number of other strands that come out in these testimonies. And this is really what I want to unfold with you today. This is not an easy topic to discuss, but it's such an important one that we're thrilled to be able to have you come on and be able to draw people's attention. All you wonderful folks that are participating in the program today, I really want you to go and check out some of the websites that Matt is involved in. The Restored book itself is restoredbook.com. You can access the book, you can purchase the book, you can download the book. So that's a very important website. But I also want you to check out two organizations that Matt is directing right now. One is called theporneffect.com, and the second is called integrityrestored.com. And so we'll take a look at some of the things happening on each of those websites today on our program. If you're getting confused by names of websites and trying to remember things, remember you can always go to mycatholicfaith.org. We're going to have a list of each of those sites and link you right to them, as well as a link to this program as well. Now let's start with another issue, and that has to do with the size, the enormity, the extent to which pornography addiction is in fact an issue today. When I went to theporneffect.com, the first thing that just jumped out at me is that 50% of Christian men identify themselves as being addicted to porn. My mouth dropped open, my jaw dropped. Could you talk to that?
Sure. Well, first we ought to say that the word addiction, how this word is applied, what it means, is something that's debated in-house among psychologists and psychiatrists. So some would say, well, it's an unhelpful term to apply to somebody because then they feel like they can never really overcome this, that this is part of their identity. But then I've heard other people say, this sums up exactly what I'm going through, and they found it rather liberating to have something to call it. But to looking at porn, sure. I mean, I find very little shocking anymore. Pornography is ubiquitous, affordable, accessible, anonymous, and because of that, porn use has skyrocketed. And it feels good. It's a very efficient escape behavior. And what I mean by that is it's that thing that we can turn to when we might feel run down or rejected or disappointed or frustrated or life feels out of control. This is something we can turn to and we feel really good for a little bit. But then, as anyone who's fallen to this sin knows, we are then plunged back into this sort of this pool of despair. And it doesn't help, it only hurts. But yes, it's ubiquitous, as I say, and so it should surprise us that many people are turning to this online drug, as it were.
Well, and you'd like to think that so when I think of addiction, I think of this incapacity to exercise self-control, right?
Yes.
That I'm stuck, I'm in bondage. And that is one of the fundamental effects of sin, is that it leads someone ever more into a state of slavery to sin, right? That St. Paul, Romans 7, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things that I do, I hate. Who is going to free me from this? And so I'm guessing that, statistically then, lots of folks listening to this program or watching and participating in this program today are being impacted by pornography. So let's take just a brief look at the side of it that the men that are watching out there, they might feel like, well, what can I do about this? How can I address this? And the Porn Effect lays out this battle plan of 5 steps in this plan to address addiction to pornography, or even if they don't feel addicted, let's say that they're maybe falling into or towards addictive behaviors. What are some of the steps that, would you unfold those? I love the spiritual beginning of prayer and fasting, and then we go from there.
Sure, I'll do that. Let's first say, though, that this is not just a men's issue. This is something that many young women today are struggling with. And so at the Porn Effect, we receive lots of emails, and I would say almost half of them are from women And whenever I go and give a talk to a co-ed audience about pornography use and why it's bad for us, without a doubt, there's always one girl or two girls who come up to me and share this with me. So the porn effect is for both men and women. And perhaps the first thing to realize when desiring to overcome pornography is to recognize this. Freedom from this stuff, freedom from sexual brokenness and our temptations isn't something that happens to you, and it's not a destination. So I think too often as Christians we can think, well, if I just say this prayer every day, then I'll be free. Or, we ask, is there a scapular I should be wearing? What's the book I need to be reading? Is there some sort of prayer that I should have someone pray over me? Is there a retreat I can go on? You see, we treat freedom as if it's this destination, as it's something that will happen to us once we've done X, Y, and Z. And I think that's not a helpful way to look at freedom from sin. I think instead we should look and think about freedom from pornography and sexual sin as a daily choice that we make by our actions. So that when we wake up, it's more helpful, instead of saying, I will never look at this again, to have the attitude, today I will not look at it. Today I will choose to be a better person. Today I will strive for love. I will reject, the counterfeit promises of pornography, and I will trust in what love has to offer, and that alone can satisfy me. So I have these 5 steps, though, because I think these are indispensable. We have prayer and fasting, accountability, getting informed, counseling, and patient perseverance. So prayer and fasting might seem rather obvious, but I think it can be very helpful. And by prayer, I think what I mean there is that, having this intimate encounter with the God who loves us, to recognize that God isn't ashamed of us. He's not disgusted with our actions. He sees why it is we do what we do. And he knows that only he alone ultimately can feel that ache and that longing in the heart that we have, that sometimes maybe feels like it compels us to turn to these lesser goods. So prayer without fasting, it's been said, is like boxing with one hand tied behind your back. Fasting without prayer is dieting. That's might be a good thing, but it's not a good enough thing. I think both are needed. So when we fast, what we're doing is we're denying ourselves legitimate pleasures in order to strengthen our will to deny illegitimate ones. Or you could put it this way: if I cannot say no to that next beer, that next slice of pizza, what have you, I'm probably not going to be able to say no to the temptation to look at pornography, which is often, much more interesting, much more tempting than, food. So there's that. Next is accountability. No recovering porn addict is an island. We need other people. And so if there's a woman listening to this, I think she should, of course, be going to confession, but should also try and find another woman that she can confide in and be honest with. And the same thing with a man. We need someone in our life that we can be real with. Because what pornography does is it fractures a man or a woman's life into sort of fragments, and we end up living lives of duplicity. So we go to mass and we're the guy, who prays, very fervently or what have you. And then we go home and we look at all sorts of shameful pornography, and we don't know how to reconcile those two things. And we're deeply ashamed about it. And so what we really need is to have this secret life of ours be exposed to the antiseptic light of truth. And so that certainly means approaching the sacrament of confession. But I think it also means having a good friend who loves us and who can encourage us in our journey. So accountability isn't about, calling you out on what you've done wrong, but it's about calling you up to be the sort of person you want to be. Shall I go over the next 3?
Well, let's dive into accountability a little bit, because one of the things that shows up in the Restored book is the way in which almost each of these couples end up leaning on some form of accountability beyond just themselves. there's one couple that begins with the husband being accountable to the wife, but they all end up one way or another turning to some outside forms of accountability, whether it's Covenant Eyes, an online-based system of accountability, but so often it ends up being folks finding accountability through some 12-step program for sexual addicts, or being connected to friends themselves, or sponsors. So this concept of accountability, I mean, it can be associated with that idea of daily accompaniment, and that sense of saying, I'm going to ask you to be able to receive contact from me anytime, day or night, if I'm struggling with this. And that sort of thing can be shocking for, like, let's just say buddies, who aren't accustomed to that type of element in their relationship. So I think men sometimes, maybe women too, they can maybe be really challenged by the idea that I'm going to be opening up a part of my life that is so shameful or disgusting and something I'd rather keep hidden. So talk about the help that seeking outside support from a group, some types of 12-step programs associated with sexual addiction, how that can be helpful.
Yeah. So while I think it might be a good thing to share with one's spouse what one is struggling with and when one falls, I do not think it is a healthy thing for one's spouse to be one's accountability partner. For one thing, I think it would be terribly inappropriate to be that specific with one's spouse about these sites I went to, what I typed in, what I find myself drawn to. I think that could be very unhelpful. So I think it's crucial that we find, a man, if we're a man, or a woman, if we're a woman, to have this accountability. I cannot recommend Covenant Eyes strongly enough. I used to work for them. I no longer work for them. So I don't get any kind of money incentive for saying this, but seriously, it is quite frankly the best accountability software out there. Basically, if you try and look at a site you shouldn't look at, or if you go to a site you shouldn't be looking at, your accountability partner will get a documented report saying when you went to that site, what you typed into Google to find that site, how long you were on that site. And you could just ask yourself, how willing would I be to go to a pornographic site if my accountability partner was standing right here looking over my shoulder? Probably not. And that's sort of the effect it has. It changes the mentality. We no longer think, how can I get around the filter? Of course, Covenant Eyes does have a superb filter. But we can now think, okay, I can go to this site. I'm very free to do it. If I want to do it, I can do it. But then I have to have a conversation with someone who loves me about why this isn't the sort of person I want to be. And then I would say certainly 12-step groups can be very helpful. We'll talk about counseling later on, and I think often when we encounter a good counselor, it'll be more helpful than not.
Well, Matt, one of the things that shows up in Restored is each of these tools that are part of this toolkit, as part of this battle plan, that each of these wives often begin with a desperate plea, a cry to God. God, why is this happening? God, where are you? God, I had no clue. God, you have to help. You have to heal, cure, change, fix, convert right now, right here. And when that doesn't immediately solve the problem, they end up moving to some forms of accountability, not only for their spouses, but for themselves, but then also counseling for not only their spouses, but for themselves and even together. The testimony of wives and that one daughter in Restored does bring out the word that I came away with was the exhausting nature of this sin. It is exhausting. And to be able to have wives be willing to come out into the open with these stories is so very powerful.
Beautiful, isn't it? And I think the thing we would want to get across with this book is you don't have to do this alone. You're not alone. I think what happens is when a wife discovers in looking at pornography, she feels conflicted. She might want to bring this to a friend, but one, she feels ashamed. She might feel like she's the only wife or the only wife in her circle of friends whose husband could be looking at this stuff. She wonders how it reflects on her personally, and so that can be very embarrassing. But then secondly, she doesn't really want to drag her husband's name through the mud. I mean, she might recognize, he's a good person who's struggling with this thing. I don't want to tell one of my best friends this and have her look at him differently. And so because of this, I think a lot of wives suffer in silence. And so this book was created. We're selling them for $2 a book. I mean, it's a big book. It's nearly 200 pages. But we're trying to just pump these things out because our desire is just to bless wives so they would realize, I don't have to go through this alone. And once you realize that, it can take a lot of the exhaustion out of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
Now, one of the things that I found striking about the testimonies were the number of stories where the husband is described as, sort of the leading guy, the guy who's, at the forefront of the community, doing good, engaged, involved, and yet there was this secret side of his life, and there's this moment of discovery, there's this moment of coming out into the open and confessing, and one of the ways of responding that showed up a number of times in the testimonies was, I didn't know that this was the guy I was marrying. And there was this sense of almost a mourning or a sense of anger that said, why didn't you tell me? How could you have kept this hidden from me? And there's this almost this need to come to embrace this idea that this is the man that God brought into my life. And even though I didn't know that, God was not caught off guard. God was not caught by surprise. And so I have to make a decision to stay in the relationship, to continue to choose this relationship, even though I didn't know that this was the guy that I was marrying.
Yeah. I think one of the effects this book might have on wives is, one, it'll help them realize that this sin is completely unacceptable and should have no place in the marital covenant at all. But I think it'll also help them perhaps have mercy on their husbands who were raised in a pornography. I think if you ask most people about their first exposure, someone showed it to them or they stumbled across it. And, you read in these stories, we've got Rachel's story here. That was the story about the husbands. The FBI showed up at her door and took the husband away to prison because of what he was looking at. If you hear that just without the context, it's very easy to feel nothing but revulsion. But she begins the story by talking about how when he was a little boy, him and his buddies would go over to the scout leader's house. And the scout leader would give them big crates of pornography videos, and they would watch them all night. I mean, that's absolutely tragic, and it's very easy to have compassion on the boy, and as I say, feel nothing but revulsion and anger towards the man until you realize they're the same person. And so while that in no way legitimizes a husband's porn use, I think it can help us to step back and say, in one sense or another, we are all victims in this pornified culture. We've all, to one degree or another, taken a hit. We're married to another wounded individual, and what's really important is this person now begins to get help. Now, if the husband's unwilling to get help, then there might come a time where the wife decides she and the family must separate from him. And that's something that I think a conversation that she ought to be having with a spiritual director or her parish priest.
Matt, that story about Rachel and her husband was so very striking. It did, in the way that you contrasted the boy and the man are the same, and you have compassion on the boy, and yet you despise the man. I just did not appreciate the extent that the wound that pornography has when young people are exposed to it, that it can carry with them into just their whole attitude towards women and their behaviors, and that marriage doesn't solve the problem. It was one of the chapters, was that, once I get married, then porn's not going to be an issue for me. It was like, wow, it was very eye-opening for me around the way that if you have early exposure to pornography, it can scar you for life. And even the way that scar is talked about, right? Scars don't have to be, they can be healed. They actually can be healed, but there's a scar and you have to acknowledge that.
Let me give you an example from Dr. Kevin Skinner's book. He's got a terrific little book, which I highly recommend, called Treating Pornography Addiction. And he speaks about a client a patient that he was counseling. Let's call him John. John was in his 30s when he came to see Dr. Skinner. And the way he first encountered pornography was this way. When he was a little boy, John's parents would fight, and his father was physically abusive to his mother. There had been times where John had tried to step in and separate the two of them and try and protect his mother, only to get hit upon by his dad. And so in order to prevent this, John's mum, when the husband was about to hit her, would throw Playboy magazines and Penthouse magazines into John's room. And so John would sit in there masturbating to these pornographic books while he's listening to his mother being beaten. That's a terrible story, but is it any wonder that now as a 30-something-year-old sitting in therapy, it's discovered that when John feels completely out of control, when his life feels like utter chaos, his body knows exactly what to do to seek medication. So this is why counseling can be so important, because it can help us get to the root of why it is we're turning to pornography.
Well, and that strikes me because that was one of the things that also shows up in Restored, this wonderful book of true stories that are testimonies from wives about experiencing restoration after this revelation of pornography addiction. That it's not only about repentance and spiritual remedies. It's not only about accountability in its variety of forms. It's also about seeking healing through counseling. That finding a safe place to explore the underlying issues, whether they are traumatic memories, personal history, personal decisions, to be able to move beyond those things. There's the story of Mimi and Matt and how there is almost like, let's call it emotional stunting of growth that happens when you have this early exposure. Talk about that.
Yeah, because what happens is you don't learn to process negative behaviors and to deal with them effectively. I didn't. From the age of 8, I would turn to porn. And so now what happens? When you take away that escape behavior, then now what do? When you experience anger, frustration, when you get upset with the kids for screaming all night, or the house is a mess and you want to be able to fix that and you wonder why the family can't keep it together, or whatever it might be, often a person will turn to their escape behavior. Now, once you remove that, you soon discover that there's this emotional immaturity. I see it in myself. And I think probably all of us would say to some degree or another, we see it in ourselves, where we haven't learned how to, in a healthy way, process these negative emotions. And so it's not just enough to remove the pornography. We then have to experience human development in these areas that haven't really matured the way they ought to.
So today, again, I'm talking with Matt Fradd, and I want you to find out more information that is really critical for so many of you that are wrestling with these issues or know others who are. They are out there. They're all around you. It might not be visible to you. So please, I want you to check out theporneffect.com. You can get that battle plan. There's 5 parts to that battle plan. Integrity Restored is such an important site because it addresses these issues of how to experience the restoration of integrity after porn, whether it's for individuals, for spouses, for parents and families, whether it's the clergy. There are resources, information, places of asking questions, getting more information. In fact, that's one of the parts of your battle plan, Matt, is this concept of gaining information. One of the things that I found so striking when I dug into the way that porn is showing up on the internet today is that I had this very naive idea that pornography was images, just pictures, because that was the reality of pornography back when I was growing up, was a magazine. But with the realm of the internet, all of a sudden you go from images to these animated GIFs, to videos, to high quality videos, to live interactive video, to hookup sites, to it goes on and on and on. And so for parents to become aware of the variety of assaults that are coming at our kids today, if we think about the effects that exposure to magazines and maybe some video had on people a decade, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we translate that to what is available, accessible, anonymous today. I'm just wondering, where is this going? Parents have to be informed.
Yeah, you're spot on. English feminist Gail Dines put it this way. She said a lot of people who are maybe older might think that when they think of pornography, they might think of a girl smiling naked in a cornfield or something like that. That's not what our kids are seeing. I mean, what our kids are seeing is body punishing, violent, degrading, humiliating acts that you probably couldn't even imagine. That is what happens when your son or daughter types in pornography, type in breasts, something like that. What they're finding is really humiliating. I'm not even going to go into it because it's that bad, but parents, we need to be aware of this, and we must talk to our children about pornography. We have to. Now, that might be a rather toe-curling thought, but you've got two options. You can let the porn industry educate your children about sex, or you can educate them about the dangers of pornography and the beauty of sex. Now, of course, we must do this in an age-appropriate way, but I think as soon as our children begin going online at your house, at school, at someone else's house, that might be around the age of 6, they should know what pornography is, and they should know what to do when they encounter it. And they should be able to come to us, and when they do that, we should pray not to flip out on them. Again, this isn't their fault, but really we should love them and emulate the same mercy and patience that Christ has with us.
Well, and you just use that word patience, and that's the last part of the battle plan, Matt, is that this is not, oh, I repent, I go to confession, and all of a sudden I'm clean and there's no remnant effects of this. No, this is something that requires patient perseverance. And the story after story in Restored, again, go to restoredbook.com. You can access the book, you can purchase it, you can find out more information about it. You hear these testimonies of these wives who said, I was signing up for a marathon, signing up for something that was going to likely be part of our relationship for the rest of our lives, that we couldn't say this was going to be done in a year or in a month. No, this was going to be part of how we walk out our married life together. Talk about that, the ways that patient perseverance show up, maybe for wives, maybe for husbands.
Well, let me just put a positive spin on this, not to be unrealistically optimistic, but just to show a different way to look at it, perhaps. When you consider the saints who lived prior to the time of the internet, I think we can say that they lacked an opportunity that we have. Certainly, sexual temptation has existed since the dawn of mankind. Certainly, the saints experienced temptations, sexual ones as well. However, they didn't experience it in the same way we do with this anonymous, ubiquitous, immediate temptation to look at whatever we want to look at. And so therefore, I want to say we have an opportunity that the saints prior to the time of the internet didn't. We can show Christ we love him by choosing not to look at pornography. And what a beautiful thing that is. When we turn our gaze to Christ and away from porn, we grow in virtue. And sometimes we might be thinking, well, maybe I'm only growing in the virtue of chastity or something. But really, when you think of what's required of the man or a woman who chooses to begin living a pure life, resisting temptation, getting up when he falls down, or she falls down, what's required of a person like that? Well, a lot of things, self-mastery, patience, gentleness, humility to get up when they've gone down, that sort of thing. So in other words, the person who is struggling with porn, and I use that word as the dictionary defines it, violently resisting porn, right? This can actually be a very effective way to grow in sanctity because, as I say, as we resist this temptation, we can grow in virtue. And so this is something, if it weren't this, it would be something else. All of us struggle with brokenness in our hearts, in our sexuality. And if this is our cross, then we can, in a sense, thank God for it because that we know that he will use this if we open our heart to him to draw us closer to himself, making us more human and more holy. But certainly we need to have patience with ourselves. St. Francis de Sales said, have patience with all things, but chiefly have patience with yourself. He says, do not lose courage in considering your own imperfections, but begin immediately every day anew to begin this task of sanctity again.
Matt, I love those reflections. It seemed very fitting, even just in terms of the calendar. So we recently celebrated the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, or the Triumph of the Cross. One of the things that I will share now and again is when we look at, in the history of the world, what was the worst thing that mankind ever did? And it was killing the innocent Son of God. But God took the worst thing that humanity ever did and turned it into the greatest thing that he ever did. That's the cross. Jesus is glorified on the cross. And if we can translate that into our own lives, our own journey, we may have been a victim, and a victim that led, by being exposed early to pornography, that may have led to dynamics where there was a whole mixture of victim and choice, and that led to a dynamic that we've carried into our adult lives, and say, why am I laden with this burden? Why do I have to face this struggle? And you beautifully identified, you know what? God was not caught off guard. God will use this. God didn't cause it, but he will use it. He will make you a saint one way or the other. And so there are elements in the restored book. And again, to hear these women testify to this, and Curran identifies that in the introduction when she says, some of these women, I mean, my goodness, they're like saints. The way that they talk about, I could learn to thank God for this. Because
yes, what a beautiful thing.
Oh my gosh.
To read. And all of these women would say that. They would say, you know, of course I wish, in one sense, I wish this had never happened, especially for my husband. But a lot of them will say, I wouldn't change anything because of what we've been through. We've grown as a couple in our relationship with God and in self-knowledge.
And one of the themes that emerges in most of the chapters of Restored is this recovery, discovery, or deepening of the insight that I am a daughter of the King. I'm a daughter of my Heavenly Father, and my sense of dignity, my sense of preciousness, my sense of love is first of all to the Father through the Son with the Spirit. It's Jesus and intimacy with Him that I discover that deepest sense of identity, and then I can come out of that towards my husband in a whole different way. And that was stirred, that was brought into their lives precisely because of the struggle with pornography. So all of a sudden it's like, talk about an unexpected gift. Talk about redemption. There it is. Talk about this idea of Christ setting free through what looked like was only going to be slavery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
Very beautiful. So Matt, let's take a look at some of the ways that Restored is part of this set of apostolates that you are working with right now. So bringing out the message that women need to be able to link into voices that they can name as their own. That maybe they're just discovering that their husbands are addicted to pornography or could potentially be addicted to porn. On your website, The Porn Effect, you talk about 10 signs that I think it was on Integrity Restored. 10 signs that your spouse may be addicted to porn. Let's say that there are spouses who are like, okay, I'm getting scared, I'm getting concerned. Talk to that issue just a bit.
Yeah, so just to clarify for people, The Porn Effect is our apostolate for teens and young adults. Restored is our apostolate for families and parishes and priests, to help priests know how to deal with this issue in the confessional, in the pulpit, and so forth. And so because it had to do with wives, it was on Integrity Restored. And so I did a video. I do videos every week. I do a video usually that goes up every week responding to a question about pornography. And this one was called, 10 signs that your husband might be looking at porn. Now, the point of this provocative title isn't to sort of incite a skepticism in a wife or to cause her to go on some sort of witch hunt to discover if her husband is or isn't looking at pornography. But rather, it's to try and hopefully it'll be the catalyst for maybe a conversation that's long overdue. And it's been my experience that often a wife will feel like she has some suspicion if her husband's looking at pornography. some of those reasons, I give 10, and I'm not going to go through all of them, of course, but, one of them would be that pornography, because it does affect the brain neurologically, that it does affect the sort of pleasure pathway system in the brain, we need to keep upping the novelty, as it were, in order to feel the same amount of stimulation we may have felt previously. And so this often carries over into the marital bed. And so if a husband is encouraging his wife to engage in behaviors that she finds degrading, then that can be a clear sign maybe that he is looking at pornography. Again, not definitely, this isn't some sort of litmus test, but it's a possibility. If the husband gets irritable when he's interrupted while he's in his office or something on his computer, that might be a sign. If he starts missing important events like the child's soccer game or the family picnic to stay at home, these can be sort of red flags. And I think, if a wife's out there and she thinks, I haven't had a real serious conversation with my husband, you might want to do that. And you might want to do that with the help of a spiritual director or a close friend who can guide you in this. But, to find some time to set it aside, maybe go out on a date where you're not distracted by the kids or anything, and just to say, look, I love you and I have a question and I want you to be honest with me. And, you might even say, I'm not going to get up, I'm not going to storm out, and I'm not even going to get angry right now, if you can help it. But I need to know, do you look at pornography, and if so, how much? And that might feel rather unnatural. A wife might feel like, if he tells me yes, I'm going to punch him in the face, Well, if you tell him that and then ask him if he looks at pornography, he's unlikely to tell you, as you would be unlikely to tell him if the roles were reversed. And so maybe praying for the grace to be calm. And then you know what you're dealing with, and you will be able to deal with it. And it'll be difficult, but you'll be living in the light, and that's a much more beautiful thing than, living in deception.
Matt, one of the words as I read through Restored, and I really, again, I found it just compelling. So folks, if you're considering getting a book to give another slice of insight into the impact of porn addiction, but beyond that, to be able to also understand pathways out. One of the things that struck me was the way in which the word honestas in Latin, that word honestas, we think of the word honesty because so much of pornography is about staying hidden. And honestas actually comes from a Latin word that means upright. It means coming out into the open with integrity. It has to do with this sense of being whole. And when I have a chance to speak to men, one of the things I'll say to them is, what is that part of your life that you want to keep hidden? And how honesty is your best protection. Honesty being a transparent willingness to come out and stand up and be present by bringing out into the open what you would rather keep hidden. What you want to keep hidden is your danger spot. And how these women each have this moment of interaction with their husband where there is a breakthrough of honestas, a coming out into the open. But what happens in the book, Restored, is that a number of these men, they're coming out into the open, their honestas isn't all at once. There are these kind of layers, there are these relapses, there's this constant battle to go back into hiding. Could you talk to that?
Yeah, it's you're right. It's an ongoing process. It's messy, like much of human life. When we think of the opening chapters of Genesis, after the fall of man, what is the first question that God asks? It's, where are you? And that's not a question, about geography. God knew exactly where they were, but he was trying to find them. Come to me. Where are you? Where are you? Not for his benefit, but for ours. Well, look where I am, and then look where I want to be. And so it's interesting that in the first question that God asks us in Genesis is, where are you? And then the first question from Christ in the Gospel of John is, what do you seek? And so those can be two very powerful questions to meditate on. Where am I? Is this the sort of man I want to be? And being very honest about that. And then maybe asking a second question, what do I seek? And being very honest about that. Because I think at the end of the day, no one, if he's sober, would say, I want to be the kind of person that looks at porn every day, or that's how I want to be remembered. I want to be remembered as the guy who cheated on his wife. Nobody says that, because we know in the depths of our hearts that we were created by love, to love, and for love, that we have love as our origin, love as our vocation, and love as our destiny. That if we don't get love right, we won't get life right. We'll remain narrow-minded, uninteresting little people whose lives are filled with the mundane that we are that just bore us. And I think that it's love that opens up our horizons, that brings color to our life. In the words of Roger Scruton, pornography uses risk the loss of love in a world where only love brings happiness. And so to meditate upon those questions, to decide who we want to be, and then to turn to our beautiful God who loves us and is inviting us to be fully alive. That God is for us. He's not against us. He's about the full flourishing of our personality, and just to know we can trust him and that we don't have to hide.
Matt, those are beautiful reflections, and God is for us, and how we talk about this concept of being hidden. One of the stories, and it may have been mentioned in another one, in Restored, brings up the one who is against us, and that's the devil. In my own, just in like poking around in this world of understanding pornography, let's focus on that spiritual side for a minute. It's my contention that the devil's capital city is called pornography, that there is a demonic element to this, and that the attempts of men to live holy lives of integrity in marriage is a demonic attack against that, because God's first blessing was what? Be fertile, multiply, and fill the earth. So it has to do with sexual integrity. It has to do with family. And the demons, the devils, they hate family, hate marriage, hate the means that God has given human beings to share in God's own creative power. So would you have anything to share about the spiritual attacks and the demonic aspects of pornography?
I'm just thinking of this now because of how you put that. I think that's Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 is what you're referring to. It's the very first command in the Bible from God to humanity. He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the face of the earth. So as Peter Kraft once quipped, he did not mean by be fruitful and multiply, grow oranges and invent calculators. Sex is a good thing. That sexual desire is a good thing. So while this is God's command to us, we might think of what the devil's sort of lie is. And he might say something, instead of be fruitful and multiply, he would say maybe be sterile, solipsistic, and fill your mind with countless images of ugliness. And I think this is what pornography does. So that was my immediate reflection. Yes, certainly, I think the devil is involved in this sin. Whenever we're tempted, of course, there's three avenues, from which we might be being tempted: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so we recognize that not every temptation is coming directly from Satan. It might be from the world, and it might just be from my own weakness of will or what have you. But certainly, I think that a sin such as this that gets to, which is such a blatant lie about who we are, because at the end of the day, this is why pornography is wrong, right? When we consider a moral action, or whether an action is moral or immoral, there's three aspects we need to look at, right? The act itself, the intention, and the circumstances. And sometimes an act can be morally neutral. So, for example, an act that's morally neutral might be killing another human being. If that's done with not the intention to kill, but say the intention to protect my family, and the circumstance is this man is trying to hurt my family, we can see that this could actually be a morally neutral or good act. But then there are certain things like murdering the innocent that are intrinsically evil. Rape would be intrinsically evil. And so no matter your intention and no matter the circumstances, it cannot change the fact that it's intrinsically evil. When we consider pornography, we often look at the circumstantial reasons it's wrong. We say it's addictive. We say it's violent. We say it corrupts the minds of young people, and so on and so forth. But even if we fixed all of these things, I think we could still say pornography is evil. Why? Well, Karol Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility wrote this: "The human person is a good towards which the only proper attitude is love." So it would follow that anything that's contrary to love would therefore be an improper attitude to hold towards another human being. And it's my contention that pornography glamorizes, celebrates, incites, and is itself documented evidence of an attitude contrary to love, namely use, objectification. So love is willing the good of the other. So it might entail wanting the other as a good while wanting the good of the other. Whereas in pornography, we don't want the good of the other. In fact, we're not even interested in the other. We reduce a person to the lowest common denominator and then, in a sense, consume them, treating their body as distinct from the person, which in a sense is what death does, right? So it's a very wicked thing. And so to answer your question very directly, summing up, I apologize for going on too long. I think certainly this is a temptation that Satan wants us to fall into because it's so central to the question of who we are and how we ought to act and treat each other.
You know, Matt, that reality of the objectification of women and all the harmful effects that has on a man or a woman who is taking in pornography on the internet is definitely showing up, right, as having negative impacts on the ability to have healthy relationships, bringing violence and other forms of vile behavior into relationships. But I think that, then talk with me a bit about this, that pornography on the internet has attempted to go beyond objectification of women to forging an illusory reality of a relationship with let's just say, with the woman on the part of a man, because of the capacity to interact now. That it's not only I'm watching a woman, but I can interact with that woman in a live sexual way. That it is even more heinous and more evil because of the false reality of a quote unquote relationship that is being that is now enabled through the internet.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that, pornography immerses all who are involved in the illusion of a fantasy world, just like you said. And so, we should agree that there is a spectrum of wickedness. When we talk about pornography, there's a spectrum here. It's not like it's all equally bad. Mm-hmm. Clearly, maybe having some kind of interaction, as you're talking about, through online media, that seems to be worse, than looking at a Playboy centerfold, maybe. But just because looking at a Playboy centerfold is less bad doesn't make it good, any more than smoking 1 pack of cigarettes a day is less bad than smoking 10 makes smoking 1 pack of cigarettes a day healthy. There's all these different avenues and new ways that pornography can lure us into this illusion. And I think the further entrenched in sin we are, the more rational insanity seems. And so that's why I think as a result of all this, you're beginning to see just this Ashley Madison. What a stupid website that was. What a heinously wicked, pathetic enterprise that was. Please God, it'll go under. Or if we think of Maxim magazine, a few years ago there was an article that was going to teach men how they could cheat on their wives so that her and the kids wouldn't find out. So just to reiterate again, the further entrenched in sin we are, the further immersed we are in this fantasy world, the more rational just insanity seems. And it's almost like God and his grace and sanctity is there to wake us up from this slumber of just this drearily, predictably boring, narrow world, and he wants to wake us up so that we might become fully alive and have lives to the full. So thank God for God and his love and grace for us, because Amen. It's possible.
Amen. Yeah. And Matt, thank you for the work that you're doing, because I think one of the antidotes is as giving on the internet itself, where so many people are looking at pornography and seeking pornography, to be able to have a solution, a path to healing, a way out. And I think that it's also a call for us as Catholics and Christians, all believers who believe in the goodness of God, the goodness of sexuality, faith in Christ, to also be positive witnesses of radiant relationships, of living the fullness of the Church's teaching, to say, look, if you're willing to embrace what the Church has to say about the good news of the body, you're going to flourish as a human being. And so I think that this is a moment of not only aggressively going after this evil of pornography and putting up hedges of defense, but of being radiant witnesses of the glory of living out the teaching of the Church.
Yeah, and I just speak to that and say, just as St. Teresa of Avila is said to have said, God save us from sour-faced nuns, I think we can also say, God save us from sour-faced anti-porn activists. A lot of the time when people in the Church speak about the negative impact of porn, they speak without courage. They speak as if we don't know who's going to eventually win the victory. And I think we don't want to do that. One, because as Christians, we ought to have a manful courage as we address this issue, and that it's more accurate to do so in that way. And two, just because it's far more attractive. When you think of the typical people standing outside of a porn shop, with their little signs, you can understand why they're doing it. But it's not there's a movement I want to join. But then you see great movements like friends of mine who run a site called Fight the New Drug. This is a secular website that's all about changing the conversation about pornography. Speaking with the executive director the other day, Clay Olson, he was saying their goal is to change the conversation from, hey, dude, check this out. If you think of pornography on an iPhone, someone usually says, dude, check this out, to, dude, that's not cool. And so I think what we want to do is put forward that we prefer people over pixels, that love is what satisfied, lust always leaves us empty, and that we want to dispense with the fake. And we want to commit ourselves to the authentic so that we can have more beautiful lives and have more beautiful love lives. I think that's the approach we want to take it from.
That's beautiful. Matt, thank you so much for taking as much time as you have with me today on the program. Again, folks, I want you to go and check out these apostolates that Matt is directing, integrityrestored.com, theporneffect.com, and please do yourself a favor. Get the book Restored. It will make a big difference for you. It'll make a big difference in the lives of someone you know and love. And the fact that they're making it available for $2 is just amazing. So restoredbook.com is going to be an important site. Again, if these sites, you're having a hard time remembering them, just go to mycatholicfaith.org. You'll find a link to this program as well as to each of Matt's sites. Matt, thank you again so much for taking time to be with me today. This was an awesome interview.
Thanks for the opportunity.